Tonight, we follow a group of players who were never meant to become what they became. Think about that for a moment. Not one player, not two, six, seven, maybe more, depending on how you count. All of them emerging from the same place, at the same time, in the same city, under the same manager. The statistical probability of that alone should give you pause. In the entire history of professional football, no single academy has produced a generation quite like this one. And yet, when people talk about the class of '92, they speak about it as though it was inevitable, as though it was always going to happen, as though Manchester United simply pressed a button and greatness came out the other side. But what if that's wrong? What if the story we've been told, the clean, comfortable, legendary version, is missing something? What if the class of '92 wasn't a triumph of planning, but something stranger? Something more fragile, something that came together. Not because everything went right, but because, at a very specific moment in time, everything could have gone completely wrong. That is the question we are going to sit with tonight. Not who they were. You already know who they were. But what they were. What this thing actually was. Whether it was genius or accident. Whether it was Ferguson or the players. Whether it was a system or a miracle. And why, in 2024, Manchester United finds itself unable to produce anything remotely like it again. Because here is the thing about Manchester United right now. It is a club that has spent over £1 billion in the transfer market since Ferguson retired. £1 billion. And it has not won a Premier League title since 2013. It has cycled through managers. It has cycled through playing styles. It has cycled through ownership structures, through footballing philosophies, through waves of optimism and troughs of humiliation. And through all of it, the same names keep coming up. Giggs, Scholes, Beckham, Neville, the class of '92. As though, if you could just bottle whatever that was and pour it back into the club, everything would be fixed. But can you bottle it? Was it ever bottable in the first place? Let's not answer that yet. Instead, let's go back. Not to the beginning, because this story doesn't start at the beginning. It starts in the middle, in the tension, in the moment before everything became clear. It is the autumn of 1995. Manchester United have just sold Paul Ince, Mark Hughes, and Andrei Kanchelskis. 3 senior players, 3 important players. And in their place, Ferguson is starting young men. Boys, really. Nicky Butt, Gary Neville, Phil Neville, Paul Scholes, David Beckham. Ryan Giggs had been there a few years already, but even he was still only 21. United lose their opening Premier League game of the season to Aston Villa. And in the commentary box, Alan Hansen, one of the most respected analysts in British football, says something that will follow him for the rest of his career. You'll never win anything with kids. It wasn't a casual comment. It was a considered opinion from someone who had won multiple league titles, who understood what it took, who had watched English football for decades. And at that moment, looking at that United team, it was not an unreasonable thing to say. These were not proven players. They were not established internationals. They were young men from Manchester who had come through a youth system that, for all its ambition, had not yet produced anything to justify that level of faith. Hansen wasn't wrong about football. He was wrong about these particular players at this particular moment. But that distinction matters because it tells us something important about what the class of '92 actually was. They were not obviously exceptional. Not at first. Not to most people. And that, quietly, is one of the most surprising things about this whole story. When you look back at the youth players who were at Manchester United's academy in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the ones who were considered the most gifted were not always the ones who made it. There were players who shone brighter in training, who had more natural flair, who scouts raved about, and who disappeared without a trace before they were 22. The class of '92 were not selected because they were the most talented young footballers in England. Some of them were, but some of them were there because of something harder to define, something that only became visible under pressure, something that had less to do with their feet and more to do with what was happening inside them. Take Gary Neville. Gary Neville, by his own admission, was not a wonder kid. He was not the player that opposition scouts were watching. He was organized, disciplined, intelligent about the game. But he was not the type of player that makes youth coaches speak in hushed, reverential tones about future greatness. He worked, he thought, he adapted. And gradually, through sheer force of application, he became one of the best right-backs of his generation, not because he was gifted in the traditional sense, but because he refused to be limited by what he wasn't. Now contrast that with Ryan Giggs. Giggs was exactly what people mean when they talk about natural talent. He was the one who turned heads, the one who made people stop during training and just watch. At 13, 14, 15 years old, he was doing things with a football that his coaches had not seen before. He was fast in a way that made defenders look like they were standing still. He had balance, close control, an instinct for the right moment to accelerate. And yet, and this is important, even Giggs needed the environment around him to realize that talent, because talent without structure is just potential. And potential, as football has shown over and over again, is the most heartbreaking thing in the sport. So what was the structure? What was it about Manchester United in that period that allowed both Gary Neville and Ryan Giggs to succeed? That allowed the very technical Paul Scholes and the more physically direct Nicky Butt to coexist and thrive? That allowed David Beckham, who would go on to become one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet, to come through at a club where he was never, by any measure, the most gifted player in his age group? The answer is not simple. And anyone who gives you a simple answer is probably selling you something. Part of it was Ferguson, but not in the way people usually describe. The mythology around Ferguson tends to reduce him to a single quality: ruthlessness, the hairdryer, the clock management, the iron grip on a dressing room. And those things were real, but they were not what made the class of '92. What made the class of '92 was something that gets talked about far less, something that doesn't make for as good a television segment. Ferguson believed in waiting, not patience in a passive sense, not sitting back and hoping, but a structured, deliberate, long-term commitment to allowing young players to develop at their own pace, inside a system that both challenged and protected them. He had seen what happened when clubs threw young talent into the first team too early. He had seen what happened when the pressure became too great before the foundation was solid. And he refused to do that, even when the results were difficult, even when the board was nervous, even when the fans were questioning. He held the line. But here is the contradiction at the heart of the Ferguson mythology. He didn't start with a plan to build the class of '92. He started with a problem. When Ferguson arrived at Manchester United in 1986, he inherited a club that was, in many ways, a mess. Not visibly. The infrastructure was there. The brand was there. The support was overwhelming. But beneath the surface, the culture was wrong. There was a drinking culture among senior players that Ferguson found unacceptable. There were players who were coasting on reputation rather than effort. There were structural problems in the way the club developed young talent, and Ferguson, who had come from a background where resources were limited and where you built from the ground up because you had no other choice, looked at this situation and made a decision. He would fix the youth system first, not because he had a grand vision of producing the class of '92, but because he could see that without a solid foundation, everything else would eventually collapse. He appointed coaches he trusted. He changed the recruitment strategy. He focused on signing local talent, boys from Manchester and the surrounding area who had a genuine connection to the club, boys who understood what it meant to wear that shirt before they ever wore it in public. And this is where something starts to feel slightly uncanny about the whole thing, because the decision to focus on local talent was, in one sense, a practical one. United were not going to outbid the richest clubs for every talented teenager in the country, but it had an unintended consequence that nobody fully planned for. It created a group of players who shared something beyond football ability. They shared identity. They shared geography. They shared the experience of growing up as Manchester United fans who then got to become Manchester United players. And that psychological connection, the feeling that this club was not just an employer, but something personal, turned out to matter enormously when the pressure came. Think about what it means to defend a club you genuinely love. Not perform for it. Defend it with your body, your concentration, your last 10 minutes of energy when everything else has gone. The players who grew up wanting to play for United didn't need to be reminded of what was at stake. They already knew. They had known since they were children, standing on the terraces or watching on television. And when things got hard, and things always get hard, that knowledge was the difference between going through the motions and going beyond them. But we need to be careful here, because there is a version of this story that becomes too comfortable too quickly. The narrative of local lads made good, of working-class boys from Manchester fulfilling a dream, is true. But it is also a story that football loves to tell about itself, sometimes as a way of avoiding harder questions. Because not every player who came through that system was a local boy. Not every player who loved the club became a great player for it. And the class of '92 themselves, as they grew older, as they became rich and famous and globally recognizable, gradually became something quite different from the boys who had grown up dreaming of Old Trafford. The question of whether they ever fully reconciled those two versions of themselves is more interesting than it might appear. Take David Beckham. Beckham is perhaps the most complex figure in this whole story, not because of what he achieved on the pitch, though that was considerable, but because of what he became off it. By the late 1990s, Beckham was not just a footballer, he was a cultural phenomenon. His face was everywhere. His marriage to Victoria Adams made him a permanent fixture of celebrity culture in a way that no English footballer had been before. And this created a tension with Ferguson that eventually became irreconcilable. Ferguson's view of football was essentially monastic. Everything should serve the game. Everything should serve the team. The moment that outside interests, endorsements, photo shoots, the machinery of celebrity, began to compete with that total commitment, something was wrong. And Beckham, through no fault that was entirely his own, found himself at the center of that conflict. He was not lazy. He was not uncommitted. He trained hard. He performed consistently. He gave enormous amounts of himself to the club for 9 years. But he also had a life outside football that had its own gravity, its own demands, its own logic. And Ferguson, watching that center of gravity shift, made a decision. He sold him. And here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because what happened next to both parties tells you something true about the class of '92 that the comfortable version never quite admits. Beckham went to Real Madrid. He played in multiple countries, for multiple clubs, and won honours along the way. He became the co-owner of Inter Miami. He helped bring Lionel Messi to American football, and he built a global empire around his name and image. By almost any measure, life after United was not a failure. But the one thing he never quite replicated, the thing that, in quiet moments, he has spoken about with a specific kind of longing, was the feeling of being part of that group, the dressing room, the shared history, the understanding that did not need to be explained because it had been built over years of being young and uncertain and working toward something together. And that longing is, in itself, one of the most honest things about the class of '92. Because the players themselves seemed to understand, perhaps better than anyone, that what they had was not simply a collection of individual abilities. It was a relationship between them and the club, between them and a particular moment in English football that has now passed. Let's think about that moment more carefully. The early 1990s in English football were a time of profound transformation. The Premier League had just begun. The Taylor Report, following the Hillsborough disaster, had led to the conversion of grounds to all-seater stadiums, which changed the atmosphere, the culture, and slowly the economics of the game. The Bosman ruling in 1995 would transform the transfer market by allowing players to move freely at the end of their contracts, opening the door to a global player market that would, over the following decades, make the kind of local academy development that produced the class of '92 economically irrational for most clubs. But in 1992, 1993, 1994, that hadn't happened yet. The world that produced the class of '92 was a world where it still made sense, financially, practically, culturally, for a club like Manchester United to invest heavily in its own youth development. Where a boy from Bury, or Salford, or the east side of Manchester could realistically expect that if he was good enough and worked hard enough, he would get a genuine chance at the highest level. Not because English football was more pure in those days. It wasn't. There was corruption and cynicism and short-term thinking then too. But because the financial incentives had not yet fully tilted against it. After Bosman, the economics changed. And after the explosion of television money, they changed even further. It became cheaper, faster, and lower risk to buy a 22-year-old from another country than to develop a 16-year-old from your own city. The developmental patience that Ferguson had extended to his young players, the years of protection and gradual exposure, became increasingly difficult to justify in a world where managers were fired after 18 months of poor results, where boards demanded immediate returns on massive investments, where the academy became a marketing exercise rather than a genuine pipeline. And so the conditions that produced the class of '92 quietly disappeared. Not all at once, not visibly, but gradually, structurally, irrevocably. When people ask why Manchester United cannot produce another class of '92, they often focus on the wrong things. They focus on the players. Are their players this good? They focus on the manager. Is there a manager as committed as Ferguson? But the deeper answer is about the world those players came from. That world is gone. Not just at United. Everywhere. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because there is still a lot we need to understand about what that generation actually was, and about the individuals who made it up. Paul Scholes is, in many ways, the most interesting case. If you asked most serious football people, coaches, analysts, former players, to identify the single most gifted player in the class of '92, a significant number of them would say Scholes. Not Giggs, whose name comes to mind first for most supporters. Not Beckham, whose global fame has permanently inflated his place in the popular imagination. Oh, Scholes, the small red-haired midfielder from Salford, who seemed, on the surface, to be the least glamorous member of the group, who gave virtually no interviews, who avoided the cameras, who went home to his family after training and had no interest whatsoever in the machinery of celebrity that was consuming the sport around him. But on the pitch, Scholes did things that made other professionals shake their heads. His passing range was extraordinary, not just in terms of distance, but in terms of weight, timing, and disguise. He could play a ball that looked, until it arrived, like it was going somewhere completely different. His movement in tight spaces was almost supernatural, the way he seemed to know, before the situation had fully developed, where it was about to go. Xavi, the Spanish midfielder who won multiple Champions Leagues with Barcelona, called him the greatest central midfielder he had ever seen. That is not a casual compliment. Xavi played alongside Iniesta, alongside Busquets, in the best club side of his generation, and he still chose Scholes. Why does this matter? Because it challenges one of the implicit assumptions in most tellings of the class of '92 story, which is that the players succeeded largely because of the system around them. That Ferguson's environment, the team structure, the shared identity, the culture of the club, that these things were the primary cause, and the talent was almost secondary. Scholes alone disproves that theory, because whatever system you put him in, whatever culture surrounded him, he was going to be exceptional. His ability was not a product of the environment. The environment was lucky to have it. And this is the tension that runs through the whole story. The tension that makes it genuinely hard to answer the central question cleanly. Because the class of '92 was both things at once. It was a group of genuinely exceptional individuals, and it was a group whose exceptionalism was shaped, directed, and in some cases made possible by the environment around them. The two things are not in competition. They were in conversation, but the balance was different for different players. Ryan Giggs needed United less than Gary Neville did, by which I mean Giggs's raw talent was so self-evident that he would have found a way to express it almost anywhere. But Neville, without Ferguson's trust, without the specific developmental culture of that academy, without the protection of a manager who refused to expose him before he was ready, might never have been more than a very good lower league right back. The environment didn't create Giggs, but it might genuinely have created Neville. And Neville, in his own way, contributed as much to the success of that team as Giggs did, because a team is not just its most gifted individuals. It is the combination of qualities, the willingness of every player to subordinate individual glory for collective purpose. And that willingness, is something the class of '92 had in extraordinary abundance. Whether that was personal character, or the culture Ferguson instilled, or simply the shared humility of people who had grown up as fans before they became players, is a question worth staying with for a moment, because it connects to something much bigger about how elite sports teams succeed, about what the research on high-performing groups consistently shows. That shared identity, shared norms, and a clear hierarchy of purpose tend to matter as much as, and sometimes more than, raw individual talent. Ferguson understood this intuitively, even if he never put it in those terms. His management style was built around a few core principles that he rarely made explicit, but that were visible in everything he did. First, the team is the unit of competition, not the individual. Individual brilliance matters, but it must serve the team. The moment an individual's ego begins to compete with that principle, it becomes a problem. Second, standards are non-negotiable. and they apply to everyone equally. Ferguson was willing to sell or drop almost anyone, no matter how talented, no matter how popular, if they stopped meeting the required standard. Roy Keane, Jaap Stam, Juan Sebastian Veron, and eventually Beckham. Third, loyalty, once earned, is absolute. The players who met the standards, who committed fully, who understood what was being asked of them, received in return something that is genuinely rare in professional football: a manager who believed in them even when results were bad, who would take the pressure publicly and absorb it before it reached the players, who created, in practical terms, a shelter inside which players could develop and fail and learn without the entire weight of a global club crushing them. That shelter mattered more than most people acknowledge. In the modern game, young players at elite clubs are exposed to extraordinary levels of public scrutiny from a very early age. Social media, the 24-hour news cycle, the global fan base, all of it creates a kind of pressure that previous generations simply did not face. When Gary Neville was coming through, if he had a bad game, it would be reported in the Manchester Evening News and perhaps briefly mentioned on Match of the Day. The criticism would fade within days. Today, a bad performance by a young player at a club like United generates thousands of tweets, video compilations of every mistake, comment sections full of assessments ranging from the passionate to the vicious. And that pressure, unless managed very deliberately by the club and the player, tends to create either paralysis or a kind of defensive psychological shell that is deeply counterproductive to development. The class of '92 developed in a quieter world. Not a kinder world necessarily. Football was brutal then too, in its own ways, but quieter. And that quietness gave them space to be uncertain, to make mistakes, to grow through failure, without those failures being permanent public record. Let's stay with the idea of failure for a moment, because it is central to the story in a way that often gets overlooked. The class of '92 did not arrive fully formed. They failed. Repeatedly. There were matches they lost. Seasons where the promise wasn't delivered. Individual performances that were poor or inconsistent. The 1995 season, when Hansen made his famous comment, was genuinely difficult. Ferguson's faith in those young players was not immediately rewarded with results. The performances were uneven. The team was learning. And in a different kind of club, with a different kind of board, with a different kind of manager, the experiment would likely have ended there. The young players would have been replaced with experience. The academy pipeline would have been deemed insufficient. The project would have been abandoned. It wasn't. Ferguson held on. Not out of stubbornness, and not because he had no other options, though it is true that the sale of Ince, Hughes and Kanchelskis had left the first team depleted in a way that made the youth players more necessary than planned. He held on because he had watched these players in training every day. He had seen what Scholes could do in a small-sided game. He had watched Butt's intensity in practice sessions. He had noticed the way Beckham could hit a dead ball with a precision that was almost mechanical. And he trusted what he had seen with his own eyes more than he trusted the analysis of people who were watching from the outside. This is another thing that the modern game has largely lost. The relationship between a manager and his players now is mediated by so many layers of data, of specialist coaching staff, of recruitment analysts, of ownership oversight, that the kind of direct, personal, intuitive knowledge that Ferguson had about his young players is almost structurally impossible. You cannot know a player the way Ferguson knew Scholes or Neville if you have a head coach, an assistant, a technical director, a sporting director, a data team, and an ownership group all contributing to decisions about who plays and who doesn't. The knowledge becomes distributed, And when it becomes distributed, something is lost. Ferguson's knowledge was concentrated. It was his. And because it was his, he could act on it with a speed and decisiveness that is simply not available to modern managerial structures. Now, let's go back to the players themselves, because we have spent time on the system and the manager and the environment, and we need to return to the human beings at the center of it. Nicky Butt. Butt is perhaps the most underrated player in the entire class of '92, and the way he tends to be discussed reveals something important about how we evaluate success. He won 6 Premier League titles with United. He was in the squad for the treble in 1999. He played for England in multiple major tournaments. He was, by any objective measure, a highly successful professional footballer. But in the conversation about the class of '92, he tends to be mentioned last, or as an afterthought, or as a qualifier. Even Nicky Butt managed to have a career. As though his success was the consolation prize, the evidence that the system was so good it could produce success even from average material. This is wrong, and it is worth understanding why it is wrong. Butt was a central midfielder who could do something that sounds simple, but is actually extraordinarily difficult. He could compete. In the physical, grinding, attritional sense of the word, he could win the ball in situations where giving it away was the easier option. He could make the runs that nobody noticed, but that created the space for Scholes to do the things that everybody noticed. He was, in the language of modern football analytics, a player with enormous off-ball value. Someone who made the team function in ways that never showed up on the score sheet, but showed up in whether United won or lost. And in a team already blessed with the technical brilliance of Scholes and the creative energy of Giggs and Beckham, Butt's particular contribution was not just valuable, it was essential. The team needed what he provided, and he provided it at the highest level, consistently, for years. The fact that he is remembered less vividly than the others is a reflection of what the media and the popular imagination choose to celebrate, not a reflection of what actually mattered. Phil Neville presents a similar case, though his story has a different texture. Phil was the younger brother of Gary, which created its own particular dynamic, the shadow of comparison that he lived in throughout his career, the constant measurement against a sibling who was already being celebrated as one of the best right-backs in England. Phil was a versatile player, capable of playing in multiple positions, which is a valuable quality in a squad, but which also meant that he was never fully associated with a single role in the way that Gary was. He was adaptable. He was reliable. He was exactly the kind of player that winning teams need. Someone who fills the gaps, who can be trusted not to harm the team, even in positions that are not his natural ones. And yet that same adaptability made it harder for him to build the kind of defining identity that lodges in the memory. His career is, in some ways, the most honest illustration of what the class of '92 actually was. Because Phil Neville was good. Genuinely, meaningfully good. Not generational, not historically exceptional, but consistent, professional, and valuable over a long period of time. And in the context of a team as strong as Ferguson's United, that kind of good was enough to win things, was enough to be part of something historic, was enough to have a career that most footballers would have given anything for. The mistake is to treat that as a lesser achievement. It isn't. We are now, perhaps, approaching the heart of the matter. Because everything we have discussed, the individuals, the environment, the manager, the historical moment, has been building toward a single question, the question that was posed at the very beginning. What was the class of '92 really? And to approach the answer, we need to sit with the treble, May 1999, that extraordinary, almost unreasonable fortnight in which Manchester United won the Premier League, the FA Cup, and the Champions League. The sequence of events in those final days of the season has been so exhaustively documented that there is a risk of becoming numb to them. But try to feel what it actually was for a moment. Going into the final game of the Champions League against Bayern Munich in Barcelona, United were losing. Not dramatically, not by a landslide, but losing in the 90th minute, a game that would define whether they were truly the best team in Europe. The players who had come through the academy, the ones who had been told they would never win anything, were preparing to lose the biggest match they had ever played. And then, in stoppage time, Sheringham scored. And then, 91 seconds later, Solskjaer scored. And Manchester United were European champions. The narrative almost writes itself. And that is part of the problem, because when something ends as perfectly as that, it creates a kind of retroactive logic. Everything that came before looks like it was pointing toward that moment. Every struggle becomes a necessary step. Every failure becomes preparation. The story feels inevitable in hindsight, even though it was anything but inevitable in the moment. Ferguson himself said afterward that he had been preparing to make a speech in defeat. He had been thinking about what he would say. It was not certain. It was not planned. It was football, which is to say it was partially chaos. And in that specific chaos, United happened to come out on the right side. The treble did not prove that the class of '92 was destined for greatness. It proved that they were capable of it. There is a difference, and the difference matters for understanding what they actually were, because destiny implies inevitability, implies that the story could only have gone one way. And if we believe that, we lose the ability to understand what was genuinely difficult about what they achieved. We lose the ability to see the choices, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, the times when it could have gone differently. And it could have gone differently. Imagine Ferguson loses his job in 1990, which was a very real possibility after several poor seasons. Imagine Scholes develops 1 year later than he did and misses the window. Imagine Beckham leaves earlier, or Giggs's injury record is different, or Butt never quite makes the first team breakthrough. Any one of these small variations, and the story looks completely different. The class of '92 as we know it does not exist. Different players come through, or don't come through, and the history of English football in the 1990s is altered. This is uncomfortable for people who love the story of the class of '92, because it suggests that what happened was not earned in any straightforward moral sense. That talent and hard work alone were not enough to guarantee this outcome, that there was contingency involved, that luck was part of it. But here is what I want you to understand about that. Acknowledging the role of contingency does not diminish the achievement. It makes it more remarkable, because to have achieved what they achieved, against the background of all the ways it could have gone wrong, requires something beyond talent and hard work. It requires the ability to perform when performance matters most, to hold together under pressure when pressure is at its most intense, to convert opportunity into outcome when the opportunity finally arrives. And those things, the ability to perform under pressure, to hold together, to convert, are themselves qualities, rare ones. The class of '92 had them, not because they were born with them, but because they were developed, tested, and confirmed over years of working in an environment that asked those questions of them repeatedly and refused to accept inadequate answers. Let us now think about something that rarely gets discussed directly. The class of '92, in their post-playing lives, have become something quite different from what they were as players. Several of them are now pundits, commentators, media figures. Gary Neville, in particular, has become one of the most prominent voices in English football analysis, known for his directness, his tactical intelligence, and his willingness to criticize the club he played for when he believes criticism is warranted. This transition from player to analyst is interesting for several reasons. First, because it represents a continuation of the narrative. The class of '92 did not disappear when they retired. They remained present, remained influential, remained part of the conversation, which means that the story of what they were is not a closed story. It is still being written, still being shaped by the choices they make as individuals in public life. Second, because their presence as analysts creates a particular dynamic around the modern Manchester United. When Gary Neville criticizes the current regime, the ownership, the recruitment, the lack of vision, he is doing something more complex than ordinary punditry. He is implicitly measuring the present against the past he was part of. And he knows that. The standard he is holding the club to is the standard he helped to establish, which gives his criticism a particular weight, but also a particular limitation, because he is not entirely a neutral observer. He is a stakeholder, someone with a specific relationship to what United was that necessarily colours how he sees what United is. Third, and this is the most interesting point, the media presence of the class of '92 has helped to keep the story of the class of '92 alive and prominent in a way that might not have happened if they had simply retired and disappeared. Every time Gary Neville appears on Sky Sports, every time Scholes offers a brief, typically blunt assessment of a United performance, every time Beckham is photographed at a major sporting event, the class of '92 is reminded to the public. The story perpetuates itself through the individuals who are still present. And this means that the legendary status of the class of '92 is not simply a passive memory. It is actively maintained. It is, in a sense, a living mythology, which raises the uncomfortable question of whether the legend has grown beyond the reality. Not in terms of what they achieved. Those achievements are documented, verifiable, and substantial, but in terms of what they are taken to represent. The idea that the class of '92 represents everything that was good about Manchester United, and that the current failure represents the loss of those values. Is that fully accurate? Or is it a story that serves certain interests, certain nostalgias, certain visions of what football should be that may not fully correspond to the complicated reality? These are not rhetorical questions designed to undermine them. They are genuine questions that deserve to be held with care. Because the class of '92 were produced by a specific set of circumstances. They were not the product of pure virtue. They were the product of a system that worked at a particular moment, for particular reasons, in a particular context. And that system was not available to everyone. The boys who got into United's academy and eventually made it were, among other things, fortunate. Fortunate in where they were born, in when they were born, in having the right teacher at the right time, in the small accidents of geography and timing that put them in a room together, at an age when rooms of people still shape who you become. To celebrate what they achieved is entirely appropriate. To treat it as a template that could simply be reproduced if only the right people were in charge is to misunderstand what it was. Let me put it this way. If you tried to recreate the conditions that produced the class of '92 today, deliberately, intentionally, as a project, you would fail. Not because you couldn't try to replicate the youth development philosophy, not because you couldn't try to instill a similar culture, but because the world they operated in is gone. The transfer market they operated in no longer exists in the same form. The media environment, the financial environment, the competitive landscape, all of it is different in ways that are structural, not cosmetic. And yet there is something in the class of '92 story that transcends these historical specifics, something that remains genuinely instructive, genuinely meaningful, even in a world that looks nothing like the world they came from. What is that thing? It is the relationship between individual talent and collective culture. The way those two things, which are so often treated as being in tension, as competing priorities, can, under the right conditions, reinforce each other, can become not alternatives, but partners. The class of '92 worked as a group because each individual within the group was genuinely committed to something larger than themselves. And they were committed to something larger than themselves, partly because each individual was valued, developed, and trusted as an individual. That is not a formula. It is not a system. It is a kind of relationship. And relationships, by their nature, cannot be planned in advance. They can only be created gradually through the accumulation of shared experience, shared trust, shared failure, and shared success. Ferguson created the conditions for that relationship to develop, but he could not force it. He could not engineer it. He could only make the space for it, and then trust that it would grow. This is perhaps the deepest truth about the class of '92. They were not built, they were grown. Now let us think again about the modern Manchester United, because we cannot leave it aside. Since Ferguson retired in 2013, the club has had David Moyes, Louis van Gaal, Jose Mourinho, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, Ralf Rangnick, Erik ten Hag, and Ruben Amorim. 7 managers in 11 years. Each of them arrived with a philosophy, a plan, a vision for what United should be. Each of them faced with varying degrees of grace and effectiveness the extraordinary difficulty of managing one of the most scrutinized clubs in world football, and none of them has won the Premier League. This is not simply a question of managerial quality. Ten Hag, for instance, is a coach with a coherent tactical philosophy and a demonstrable track record. Mourinho won multiple league titles in multiple countries. Van Gaal is one of the most decorated managers in European football history. These are not mediocre appointments. And yet, none of them has been able to give United what it had under Ferguson. Why? The easy answer is that Ferguson was uniquely exceptional, a once-in-a-generation figure whose combination of qualities cannot be replicated. And that is probably partly true. But it is an answer that lets the structure off the hook, because the managers who have come after Ferguson have not simply been defeated by his shadow. They have been defeated by something structural, by the absence of the conditions that allowed Ferguson to do what he did. Long tenure, genuine authority over football decisions, the ability to plan on a timescale longer than a single transfer window, the board's willingness to absorb short-term pain for long-term gain. Ferguson managed United for 26 years. 26 years. In that time, he saw through cycles. He saw through bad seasons and good ones. He saw through the period when Cantona arrived and transformed the team. He saw through the development of the class of '92. He saw through the treble. He saw through the Ronaldo years. He built and rebuilt multiple times because he had enough time and enough trust to do it. No manager at United since has had that, not remotely close to it. And without that stability at the top, without that long view, the kind of patient academy development that produced the class of '92 is structurally impossible. You cannot ask a manager who might be fired in 18 months to commit to a 16-year-old whose first team impact might be 4 years away. The incentive structures simply do not allow it. And so, the youth development at United, which was once a genuine pipeline to the first team, has become something else. A finishing school, perhaps, or a recruitment asset, but not the kind of serious, committed, long-term development environment that it was when Eric Harrison was coaching Giggs and Neville and Scholes and Beckham in the late 1980s. Eric Harrison. This is a name that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Harrison was the youth team coach who worked with the class of '92 during their formative years at United. He was demanding, he was detailed, he was deeply knowledgeable about the game, and he had the rare gift of being able to push young players hard without breaking them, of finding the line between challenge and destruction, and staying on the right side of it. Gary Neville has spoken about Harrison with something that approaches reverence, not just as a football coach, but as a person who shaped the way he thought about the game and about life, as someone who gave him a standard to aim for that was genuinely his own standard, not a borrowed one. And when you hear players speak that way about a coach, with that specific quality of gratitude that goes beyond professional respect, you know that something important happened between them, something that was about more than tactics and drills. Harrison is, in some ways, the invisible architect of the class of '92. Ferguson is the face, the decision maker, the figure whose choices made the whole thing possible. But Harrison is the person who actually sat with those boys during the years when they were still boys, who taught them not just how to play football, but how to think about football, how to read a game, how to respond to failure, how to hold themselves to a standard that would eventually set them apart. And the fact that Harrison is not as widely remembered as Ferguson tells you something about how we tend to attribute success. We give it to the person at the top, the visible leader, the decision maker. And that is not wrong. Ferguson deserves the credit he receives. But it is incomplete. Because the class of '92 was not produced by Ferguson alone. It was produced by a team of people, coaches, staff, backroom figures, who contributed quietly, consistently, over a long period of time, without the recognition that their contribution deserved. Let's shift the perspective now. Let's think about what the class of '92 looked like from the outside. Not from United's perspective, not from Ferguson's perspective, but from the perspective of the other clubs, the opposition, the managers and players who faced them across the width of a football pitch and had to find a way to deal with what they were. Because from the outside, the class of '92 was unusual in a specific way. They were technically very good, individually, but they were unusual primarily because of their cohesion. The way they understood each other's movement, the way they communicated without speaking, the way the team functioned as though it had a single intelligence shared between its parts. This is something that takes years to develop. You cannot buy it. You cannot import it from another league. You can only build it slowly, through thousands of hours of shared experience. Opposing managers noticed it. They would talk about how difficult United were to create chances against, not just because of the quality of individual defenders, but because the defensive shape had an organic quality. It adjusted, it covered, it anticipated in ways that felt less like a system and more like an instinct. And that instinct was the product of years of playing together, of knowing each other, of the kind of deep familiarity that makes individual decision-making and collective effectiveness into the same thing. Arsenal under Wenger had it, in their own way. Liverpool under Dalglish had had it before. But United under Ferguson, with the class of '92 at its core, had it at a level that was genuinely rare. And when they lost it, not through any single event, but through the natural process of aging, of retirement, of the generation moving on, something changed about the team that was not easily replaced. Keane left. Scholes retired the first time. Giggs became a squad player rather than a starter. And each departure was not just the loss of a player, but the loss of a piece of the living knowledge that those players carried between them. Knowledge that had never been written down, had never been codified, existed only in the relationships between people, and disappeared when those people were no longer in the same room. This is one of the deepest and most overlooked aspects of the Class of '92 story. Knowledge that is distributed across relationships cannot be transferred. It can only be recreated from scratch through the same slow process of shared experience. Which is why trying to replace the Class of '92 by buying different players and installing them in the same positions was always going to produce something technically similar, but experientially different. The positions were the same, the knowledge was not. Now, we are coming toward the end of this journey, not the end of the story. The story of the Class of '92 is still ongoing, still being discussed, still being argued about, but the end of our particular journey through it. And it's time to answer the question we've been circling. What was United's Class of '92 really? Here is the honest answer. Built from everything we've examined. They were not, primarily, a product of planning. Ferguson did not sit down in 1986 and design a system specifically intended to produce 6 or 7 world-class players from the same generation. He made decisions based on the problems he was trying to solve. A dysfunctional senior culture, a depleted squad, a limited transfer budget. And those decisions, combined with the quality of the people he employed in his youth structure and the specific individuals who happened to be in that generation, produced something nobody had fully anticipated. They were not purely a product of talent. Some of them, Scholes, Giggs, were exceptional in ways that would have found expression almost anywhere, but others were made by their environment in a meaningful sense. The culture, the protection, the patience, the long-term commitment to their development, these things converted competence into excellence, potential into reality. Without that environment, some members of the Class of '92, as we know it, would not exist. They were not simply a product of luck. Chance played a role in the timing, in the personnel, in the specific sequence of events that brought them together. But luck does not explain what they did with their opportunities. Luck does not explain the performance in Barcelona in 1999. Luck does not explain 20 years of sustained excellence. They created outcomes through choices that were their own. They were, instead, a particular alignment, a specific combination of individual qualities, managerial vision, institutional culture, historical timing, and collective identity that came together in a way that has not been repeated and probably cannot be repeated, not because the components are impossible to find individually, but because the conditions that allow them to align in that specific way no longer exist. And understanding that, really understanding it, is not depressing. It is clarifying. Because it means the Class of '92 was not a formula. It was not a product. It was not a system that could be installed and run. It was a living thing, specific, unique, unrepeatable, born from a particular moment in football history, shaped by people who happened to be exactly where they needed to be, sustained by a culture that no longer exists in the world that created it. And that is why it matters. Not as a template, not as a standard that modern clubs fail to meet, but as evidence that this kind of thing is possible, that talent and culture and leadership and timing can, under the right conditions, produce something that exceeds what any individual part could produce alone. That collective greatness is real, not just a metaphor. The Class of '92 proved that, not through a single game, not through a single season, but through years of sustained achievement that forced the world to take notice, that outlasted trends, that survived the end of the generation that created it and continued to mean something in the years that followed. They were not just a moment. They were proof of something. That sometimes everything aligns. And when it does, it creates something football will never forget. Good night.